Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I thought I would go ahead and do a part 6 of this series in explaining my perspective on the basics of conjugate style training. And today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why the sumo deadlift. And it actually is a lot more simple than a lot of people realize. Now, we can argue about conventional versus sumo for powerlifting all day long. But when it comes to something like the conjugate style training and it comes to carryover to sports, it talks about carryover of one lift to another. It makes a lot of sense that a system of training like this tends to lean in the direction of sumo deadlifting. And it's not to say conventional deadlifting can't have its place in it, and deficit conventional deadlifts and all of these other lifts can't work because they are certainly used by many people as part of the system. But it tends to lean in the direction of sumo working oftentimes better for it. Now, the most obvious thing up front has to do with the fact that box squats are used, right? Box squatting, because it tends to be wider stance, it tends to have really good carryover to the sumo deadlift. In other words, when you get stronger at the box squat, you tend to get stronger at the sumo deadlift. And particularly when you start rotating in things like safety bar box squats, right? If you do safety bar box squats and then compare those to the way a sumo deadlift feels, you really understand, particularly when you're using a wider stance, you really understand the carryover. A movement like that is actually a direct assistance movement for it. Well, if that's something you're doing regularly, as even one of your max effort lifts, it makes sense that it carries over tremendously. So that's a big factor because you're doing so much box squatting. The box squat is a fantastic accessory and assistance movement, and the different variations of it for actual sumo deadlifting better than it is for conventional deadlifting. So that's absolutely a factor. Well, then we come over to the fact that a system of training like this tends to utilize maximum training volumes. And particularly your speed pulls. Think about the speed day, what goes on. You're doing very large numbers of sets on speed pulls. Well, what is it that a lot of strength and conditioning coaches feel about the sumo deadlift? A perfect example, take like Matt Winning, who himself has an advanced degree in exercise science, elite level power lifter, coaches lots of strength athletes, and including even like football players and things. He coaches people outside of just, you would think of as traditional strength sports, right? He works with football players and people like that. It's his opinion that the sumo deadlift is easier to recover from in terms of training load. And when you think about the fact that it actually puts less stress on the lower back, it tends to be a little more quad dominant, a little less back dominant. Now, once you get it down, now for me, I'm still working on getting the sumo down. For me, I do have some mobility and muscle weakness issues with it. And this system is, for me, forcing me to work around those things and to shore up those weaknesses. But when we start talking about recovery, it's the same thing we get into with box squats. If you can do more total training volume with a big movement, especially your big exercises, you can get more size and more strength out of them, right? If you can recover from more volumes of training. Well, the box squat is easier on your overall recovery while still being an axial loading exercise, a big exercise. And that's one reason it's used. Well, the sumo deadlift falls into that same category. It seems to be easier to recover from because of the different stress on the lower back. Then we start combining that with things like messing with deficits and a lot of these other variations that are even easier to recover from. Because what do we have? People like Dr. Mike Israetel's discussed that quite a bit in the past, hasn't he? Deficit deadlifts are better for hypertrophy because they work the same amount of muscle through a longer range of motion, but they're easier to recover from, so you can do more training volume. We're able to do more training volume, and deadlifts are notoriously hard to recover from. So if we can do more training volume on a variation, what happens? We're going to get stronger faster. If we can do more volume and recover from it, we're going to get stronger faster. Well, if we've done the same thing with box squats, and box squats allow us to train more and recover slightly easier than a normal back squat, and the sumo deadlift allows us to train slightly more and recover from it and get stronger faster. Well, that makes sense. But then what happens when you have these two variations that oftentimes are a overlap in terms of carryover? In other words, the box squat and the sumo deadlift actually carry over to each other very effectively. Well, now we've created a synergy, haven't we? We're creating a synergy between these lifts, because we now have a variation of the squat and a variation of deadlift that actually have direct transfer to each other's movement patterns and muscles work. So they're actually, in some cases, assistance movement to the other, but they're always an accessory movement to the other. We're doing both every week with all these different variations that carry over, and because of the nature of both of them, they allow for higher training volumes than our normal classical lifts. All right, this is part of the secret to why guys who use these systems maximally get really, really strong. It's a big factor. Then you go over to things like the hip belt squat. The hip belt squat, because of the nature of the way you usually have to set it up, lends itself to a wider stance. You know, that's one that I'm using. It carries over directly to both of these lifts in terms of the lower body movements. It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense why the sumo deadlift is used in this system. And what do we know about this system also? What does Louis Simmons always say? In his experience, and he does work with athletes who are not even powerlifters at this point. He trains a lot of people who are sprinters. He's messed with some football players. A lot of hybrid coaches coach these same methods for their athletes. Look at the templates. You guys see someone like Alex Viata, right, who runs Complete Human Performance. Look at the templates that Joe DeFranco uses for guys getting them ready for the NFL combines and stuff. It's all this conjugate style training. Well, what does Louis say about the wide versus narrow? Wide carries over to narrow better than narrow carries over to wide. So training the sumo deadlift will actually train your conventional deadlift better than the conventional deadlift trains the sumo, although there's transfer. But he's right. If you squat really wide stance to get strong at it and you come over and try a narrow stance, you're going to be strong at it. Doesn't work the other way. These wider stances have better carryover to narrow. Then let's come over and let's talk about sports. What carries over better to field sports? Wider stance. In fact, the wider stance actually gives you all the benefits that any coach would talk about with unilateral training. Say, oh, you've got to learn to train one leg at a time for whatever reason. You actually get all the benefits they think you get out of that just from the wider stance, thus eliminating the need completely for single-legged exercises, even for sports. We're seeing successful coaches coach these sort of methods for their field athletes, for football players and things, for serious athletes, real athletes, because a lot of people will argue that powerlifters aren't real athletes. That's fine. That's kind of a silly point because it is an actual real performance-based sport, but all right. You want to say that multifaceted athletes are real athletes. Well, a lot of really good coaches are getting people contracts training them this way, using all this stuff. It absolutely works. But the wider stance does have, in theory, better carryover to sports. So when we look at it in its totality, it makes sense that the sumo deadlift gets utilized. And notice you guys see me doing a lot of variations of sumo just in this video in the background. You see me doing speed work with chains, speed work with bands. You see me doing normal sumo. You're going to see me at the end doing deficit sumos. But it's all sumo. Just like with the box squats carrying over, training all these different variations falls within conjugate. But look at the amount of transfer. All of these variations also will transfer to your squat. The squat transfers to them. The hip belt squats transfer to it. Everything carries over into a flow. And when you start to understand that, and you start to understand that getting generally strong and training these variety of movement patterns of how they feed into each other and carry over into each other, this system starts to make sense. All right, it's a very complicated system in a lot of ways, but the idea is simple. It's about a wide variety of movement patterns being trained, a wide variety of performance elements being trained, but training them in a systematic manner in which they all flow into each other. And you learn to train all of them at once so that one thing makes you good at everything else when it's worked into the system. It's why you do max effort work, you do speed strength work, you do volume work for all those different performance elements. And then the same thing, we do all these different stances, but you pick the stances for the majority of your work as your baseline that allows you to get the most strength carryover to everything else that you do and allows for the highest training volumes so that you can train more. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.